Back in December 2018, my wife and I went on a short trip to Iceland. We found a super good deal with WOW Air, and it was $200 round trip from Montreal to Reykjavik. Unfortunately, because of my work schedule, we had only 3 days for this trip. For us, the top attractions were the famous Seljalandsfoss waterfall, the plane wreck in Solheimasöndur, the Diamond Beach, Kirkjufell Mountain, and of course the city of Reykjavik. About the camera gear we brought on the trip, I had my Nikon D800E with 16 to 35mm and 70 to 200mm lenses. My wife brought her Fuji X-T1 with her only lens, the 18 to 55mm. I also had a DJI Spark that I used it only once. We drove from Ottawa to Montreal and took the WOW Air flight and landed in Reykjavik at 7:30 a.m. Then we quickly rented a car and started driving on Highway 1 toward our first target, Seljalandsfoss. It was only a 130-kilometer drive, but we stopped a lot to take pictures. The scenery was different from everything else we had seen before. The black sand with a different type of green, very few trees, and of course Icelandic horses as a bonus to the landscape. There was also these lonely cabins that I think have a lot of character, but there wasn't enough time to look for that dreamy composition, so I quickly grabbed these shots. Finally, we got to Seljalandsfoss. It wasn't super busy, but there were several photographers around. I had my 16 to 35mm lens on the camera and took several photos, but I didn't like most of them. I climbed these stairs behind the fall and took this picture, which is a panorama with my ultrawide lens. Of course, many photographers use this composition, but this is my version and I like it for this reason. The person standing under the fall shows the scale of the image. My wife took a totally different approach. She didn't have an ultrawide lens, so she focused on the people and took these images that I think are really good. I also like these seagulls nesting on the rocks and took few pictures that are nothing special, but I show them as a part of the trip story. And here, another lonely cabin. After the waterfall, we drove to Solheimasöndur, which was 40 kilometers ahead. And of course, again, we stopped many times to take photos. Here, I found this Icelandic chapel in the distance, and I used my 70 to 200mm lens to take this image. And I really like how it turned out. Other things that caught my attention was these sheep grazing on the mountains. We also got tempted to visit Eyjafjallajökull, which is a volcano, but there was no time. Then we saw these buildings that I'm not sure what they were, but I think it was part of a farm. I found this scenery really beautiful and grabbed this massive panorama that I think is really good. At the same time, my wife focused on the road and took these photos. Look at this no drone sign, probably for protecting the birds. Then we saw a massive rainbow and I took this picture, which is really cool because it shows where the rainbow goes into the ground. We finally got to the location of plane crash in Solheimasöndur. If I remember correctly, we parked at this spot and then there was an almost 1 hour walk on this black sand road to the plane location. Of course, we weren't alone and many other people were going to the same place. On the road, I used my 70 to 200mm lens and took some photos of this beautiful rock in the distance. We finally got to the plane wreck, and many people were taking photos with the plane and some people with the beach. Of course, it's really hard to take a non-cliché photo in super touristy locations like this, but it's about the memory of the trip, and I think if I take my own photo from the spot, it makes me remember that visit forever. I also took this portrait of my wife, which I think is really good. Then we put the Fuji on tripod and took this picture. We finished our visit and walked back to the car. By the time we got there, it was past noon, and of course this time of the year, sunset time in Iceland is around 3 p.m. So it was getting dark. So we decided to spend the night at Vik, which is a small but famous village with around 300 residents. When we started driving, we got hit by heavy rain and driving condition was less than ideal. We found this guest house and got a room for the night. By the time we got there, it was around 2 p.m. and you can see from the photos that it was getting dark. We had the view of the famous Vik Church from our hotel, and I took several photos that I think this one is the best of them. After relaxing a little in the hotel, we found a restaurant nearby and tried the famous Icelandic beer called Gall. In the morning of day 2, we left the guest house and started driving toward the Diamond Beach. It was a 2-hour drive, but we stopped several times on the way to take pictures. I found the road very interesting. It was very quiet and the type of greenery and the black sand on the side of the road was very interesting. And of course there were no trees at all. We saw several waterfalls and lonely cabins on the way. But the most interesting scene, and maybe my best photo of the whole trip, was from this beautiful waterfall scene. I took several photos with my ultrawide lens and stitched them together to get this massive panorama. If you are going to visit Iceland, I highly recommend bringing an ultrawide lens with you because it's the only way to capture the vastness of the landscape. And again, we noticed some horses grazing on the mountains. Here we stopped to take pictures of this mountain with this black sand road, and I used my drone for the first and only time in this trip and took this video. And again, more Icelandic horses, and these 2 pictures are my favorite photos of them. The road itself was very beautiful. Here I noticed these beautiful swans and immediately pulled over to take pictures of them. They were very large, and later I found that they are called Hooper swan and are the only species of swan living in Iceland. Then we saw this beautiful glacier. I took many pictures from the distance and made this panorama, but in the end I think the simple photo that my wife took shows it better. A little while after the glacier, we finally got to the Diamond Beach. We parked the car and walked over the black sand. Of course it was cold and windy, but many people were there and enjoying the view of ocean with blocks of ice washed on the shore. I also took this picture of this couple and I think it's a good one. I also like this photo of my wife with ice blocks and the bridge. And here is another view of the bridge in the middle of black sand and no vegetation. Having seen the Diamond Beach, our second day mission was completed, so we drove back toward Reykjavik. On the way we stopped to grab a bite at this place called the Skaftarskáli. The interesting thing was that we didn't see any McDonald's or Starbucks. It was a 5-hour drive to Reykjavik and it was getting dark, so we drove non-stop and got back to our hotel at night. Day 3, we woke up early in the morning, and with only 1 day remaining, we had to decide between Kirkjufell and the city of Reykjavik. After lots of thoughts, we finally decided to spend the last day chilling at Reykjavik. We started our day early in the morning and it was still dark. The first thing that we did was visiting the famous church called Hallgrímskirkja. Having my ultrawide lens, I easily managed to fit everything in the frame. I also took one with the statue of Leif Erikson in front of the church. My wife didn't have an ultrawide and took a different strategy and again focused on people and took these photos that I think are really good. We took a walk around the city and despite being dark and a little cold, I found the atmosphere really joyful and warm. One thing that caught my eye was this photography gallery that had a collection of city shots, and I bought this print from them as a souvenir from Reykjavik. We took more photos from the buildings and people until this photo. I lost all of my photos after this one. The reason is that I used a crappy card reader to transfer my photos to the laptop. Here is the crappy card reader that I kept as a lesson. Fortunately, we still have my wife's photos from the Fuji X-T1. So we continued walking in the city until the sun came out, and we stepped inside the church and went to the top of the tower to see this view of the city. My wife took several pictures that showed the colorful view of Reykjavik. And then we found this little cafe and finished our Icelandic adventure with some traditional Icelandic food. In the end, I think Iceland is a really beautiful place, especially if you are into photography, and we will definitely visit again very soon. So that's it. I hope you liked this video. If yes, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Also, feel free to follow me on Instagram.